Andrew, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. So my name, you can call me Andy. I've been a philosophy professor for 20 plus years. More recently, I crossed over into the dark side of administration. I was the director of the Janet Prindle Institute for Ethics for about 7 years at a small liberal arts college in Indiana. And I just got hired by the University of Cincinnati to be the founding executive director of the Cincinnati Ethics Center, which launched in January. Most of my background is in moral reasoning, moral epistemology, moral reasoning development, connections between ethics and leadership, but I dabble in philosophy of religion as well. So I think that's why I'm here today.
Cool. So could you tell me more about skeptical theism and the problem of evil? What is your position on those two and how they relate?
Yeah, sure. So the problem of evil, I'll just give a sort of short, simple version because it's easier to say what skeptical theism is if you introduce the problem of evil first. So the problem of evil is roughly the idea that if there were a God that had three properties: omniscience, knows everything; omnipotence, has the power to do anything possible; and omnibenevolence, is morally good, maximally loving, then there'd be something with the power, knowledge, and desire to prevent evil from happening. And so you'd think that there wouldn't be, if there were such a being, there wouldn't be all this evil in the world unless there were some reason to permit it. There can't possibly be a reason to permit all the evil that we see in the world, pain and suffering. And let's define evil as just unnecessary pain and suffering. So there must not be such a thing. That's the logical problem of evil in a nutshell. A lot of defenses against the problem of evil are what you call greater good defenses. Roughly, they try to point to some reason that instead of God, I'm say triple O being, right? Has those three O's, right? So a triple O being, they try to come up with possible things that a triple O being might have in mind. Some people say like a free will defense, right? You don't want creatures who are robots. You want to allow for some of the greatest goods like love. Like if you think love is a great good, you can't really have genuine loving relationships if we're all just programmed to do the right thing the whole time. So if you're going to allow for genuine acts of love, you need to allow people to do bad things, something along those lines. They need to be free to not be loving, because love is better when it's free. Some people think it's conceptually impossible to love without the freedom to be bad. So, but those are greater good type defenses. The skeptical theism it's an interesting one because it's basically doing a bunch of epistemology and thinking about our moral reasoning capacities generally. The skeptical theist looks at the premise that says there couldn't possibly be a good reason for a triple O being to allow all this stuff. So that's the same premise that the greater good defenses offer or go after. But instead of offering a greater good, it says, we should be skeptical about whether or not we should have good reason to accept that premise. So some people call it a kind of, they'll say that the problem of evil, the defense of that premise is what they call a no-see-em objection. I no-see them, so they must not be there, right? And they say that's a bad inference to make. And so it's not outright rejecting the premise. It's just saying we don't have good reason to accept that premise. And the traditional skeptical theist response says, look, we just don't have any idea what it would be like to be an omniscient being. And we have no idea what evidence could be out there for allowing the world to be the way it is. And so we shouldn't accept that premise. So it's not rejecting the premise outright. It's saying we don't have any rational basis to accept it because we lack the capacity to judge what a triple O being might have reason to allow. Something along those lines. That's the classical skeptical theist response.
Could you explain more what you mean when you say we're not justified in believing that premise? Like, because it seems like it would be entailed by the definition of a perfectly good being that it would want to prevent possible. It seems like those are like synonymous definitionally. So what would it mean to say we're not justified to believe that premise?
So it's well, it's just like suppose you think. So let's go back to the greater good defenses, like free will, right? A perfectly good being, it's not going to be synonymous with a perfectly good being that they wouldn't allow any pain and suffering. They might not allow what you might call unnecessary pain and suffering that isn't part of a world where there's some other great good that sort of outweighs it, right? So greater good defenses, they're not going to say a perfectly loving being will prevent all evil, all pain and suffering. They'll only prevent pain and suffering, or they'll allow it rather, if there's some greater good that can't be obtained without allowing for the possibility of those things, if that makes sense. And so the skeptical theist is saying, I don't even need to offer up what that possible thing might be. All I need to acknowledge is that for all I know, there could be some good that outweighs the pain and suffering that I see around me, that from my perspective seems unnecessary. But I couldn't judge that an omniscient being who had intellectual capacities that vastly exceed ours might not have some greater good in mind. And that's the thing they're saying we're not justified in accepting. Now, there's some significant problems with that response, but I don't think it's a definitional one, like what you described.
So it's simply just like the unknown greater good? Is it?
Yeah, so it's like roughly they say, for all we know, there could be some greater good. And we lack the intellectual capacity to determine whether or not that thing could exist or not. We can't imagine what it would be like. They might, another way to put it is like, for all we know, if we were omniscient, right? If we knew absolutely everything there was to know about the world, past, present, and future, then we might well spot a greater good that we lack the intellectual capacity to spot right now, given our limited cognitive capacities compared to a triple O being. That's sort of how it goes.
Gotcha. So yeah, that's I didn't realize it was called skeptical theism, but that was just an extension of Plantinga's greater good argument. He just starts with free will, then goes to some unknown greater good.
Yeah. There's some similarities to the greater good. It's just saying we don't need to identify a greater good.
Gotcha.
All we have to do is say that we lack the intellectual capacity to reason that there couldn't be one. And if we were omniscient, maybe we'd see it. Something along those lines. Now, I actually think theists should be very worried about that reply.
Why?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. So if you're just doing this as a pure intellectual exercise, yeah, great. But most theists, they embrace, and I'm sorry, are there comments coming up? Should I be?
No, ignore the comments.
Okay, cool. Them. All right, yeah, I've got you on a little tiny screen so that it looks like I'm looking at you. And so I can't see any of these comments. Sorry.
That's a good thing. It's usually better to ignore the comments on social media.
Don't read the comments.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So where was I? Okay. If you're just doing this as like an abstract philosophical exercise, you might be perfectly fine with that response. But most theists have a particular kind of theism that's fleshed out with a lot of additional stuff. Like take Christian theists, for example. Christian theists make a lot of claims about God, right? They make a lot of claims like God will keep promises. They hope that they're going to go to heaven if they do the right things or whatever. Believe the things they're supposed to believe, or whatever the faith tradition is. The bottom line is they purport to be reasoning about what God would do, right? Now, if you say, well, gosh, I have no idea if a triple O being might have a good reason to outweigh this, you're basically saying, I can't reason about what God would do in the face of all this horrendous evil. Well, that cuts both ways, right? So take a promise that a Christian theist might think God has given to his people, like do this and you will be rewarded with eternal salvation, right?
I will never flood the world again. Rainbows.
Yeah, exactly. I will never flood the world again. And that's what this rainbow is supposed to mean, which I didn't understand that. But anyway, well, for all you can run the skeptical theist response. Well, wait, how can you be so certain about that? Because for all you know, God might have a really, really good reason to promise you eternal salvation and then still burn you in hell forever. Like what? Like how can you not read? You're not a triple O being, right?
Could you go further than that and say like he has a reason to make a promise and then also a reason to break that promise?
Yeah, right. I mean, and for all you know, he could, right? For all you know, this is some game that God's playing with angels or something, and you have no idea if God might have reason to break his promises to you. And so this is so I think theists who want to be able to make any positive claims about what they think God might do should be leery of that kind of response.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really interesting argument because theists mostly say like it's impossible for God to lie or whatever, but maybe there's some greater good. Maybe there's some greater good that allows him to lie. Maybe there's some
I,
greater good to allow him to sacrifice your children. Maybe there's some greater good to allow him to do any potentially evil thing we could imagine.
yeah, I don't want to get us off track, but like I've never understood that claim that it'd be impossible for God to lie. I mean, killing seems worse than lying. And a lot of that happens, right? If God exists, he's the cause of death of 100% of the population, right? So like the idea that like God would never lie, I never understood that. Why like if if God has if there's a God that has reason that outweighs all the evil that we see, is it really that hard to believe that God might also have reasons that outweigh an occasional not lying scenario? So anyway,
Yeah, I definitely see that as the same kind of contradiction where they want to put a human element where they can understand him and his actions, God and his actions, but then also want to say that there may be some higher thing that we can't understand, which is answers all the questions that we don't, that give us some kind of cognitive dissonance with this idea
yeah,
of a God.
yeah.
So why would I don't know. I don't know if that would be compelling to most theists, though. I think most would probably just say that maybe there's some things we can understand, but some things we don't understand. And so it's possible that we understand part A just fine, but part B, like why he allows all this suffering, maybe that's a problem, or maybe it's just a response to like the logical problem of suffering. Like if someone says it's logically impossible for there to be a God, well, oh, it's not logically impossible because maybe there's some good reason or something.
Yeah.
And so in that context, it would be fine. But it wouldn't. I don't think it would lower any theist confidence they have in their personal God that they actually know and speak to him and he answers prayers in any way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it might not be psychologically compelling. It might not it might not cause them to change a view. But on pain of irrationality, I think theists ought to seek uh, a response to the problem of evil that is coherent with the rest of their worldview. So I don't like ostrich head in the sand kind of theism, right? It's just like I'm optimistic that there are reasonable, coherent frameworks that theists could adopt, and I think they ought to. I think they ought to still wrestle with this. So, and I mean, there are. So, I guess I could talk a little bit. I've written a little bit about this problem. I don't know how you even got my name connected to skeptical theism. How did you even find?
I do tons of research on the topic, and I don't remember exactly how I heard yours because I
Okay.
do this all the time. I have thousands of names listed everywhere.
Okay, cool. If you encountered that edited volume by Doherty and McBrayer, essays on skeptical theism, because I had an essay
Maybe,
in that, so that might have been it.
probably.
So I think there might. So this problem that I just identified, it's called the reasoning about God problem, or at least I'm calling it that, right? Like if you say I can't reason about God when I'm thinking about the problem of evil, I don't think you can reason about God in your own, as you're living out your own faith. So it's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. Maybe it gives you a response to the problem of evil, but it also, I think, completely undermines your ability. So I wrote an essay called Two Different Versions of Skeptical Theism. There might have been two new versions. And so I can kind of just try to walk you quickly through both of those. I think they're a little more promising. I'm not sure how well I think they work. I think I'm not super confident in any of my philosophical views. I don't think anybody should be. It's all, I think Aquinas said, when I look at my theology, it looks like straw, which is admirably intellectually humble for a theist. So one way to respond, I tried to use this analogy, is that I do think there are going to be cases where you can reason about someone's behavior and suspend judgment in one case, but in general, make inferences about how they would normally behave. So I was thinking, I think an example I used is, suppose my dad, whom I have reason to believe is just like, pinnacle of virtue. I get evidence that he's murdered someone, right? Or that's what everybody's saying. And I might think, whoa, okay, I'm not inside my dad's head. I could, maybe I should suspend judgment about this particular case, like this particular thing. Like, I'm not inside his head. I normally think he's a stand-up person. I'm going to suspend judgment about whether or not it was an unjustified killing. For all I know, he could have had a good reason that I'm unaware of, right? And then he calls me up and says, hey, look, can I meet you? Something crazy's happened. I promise it'll make sense, right? Something along those lines, right? I don't think I'm completely unable to reason that my dad might keep his promises in the future. So I do think there's some sort of asymmetry there that's worth exploring. I think it's hard to articulate. I don't think the analogy is a perfect analogy. But it gave me an idea. There's this area in epistemology, thinking about reasonable disagreement. And I'm going to introduce a couple of technical terms. I don't know if you're familiar with is your background in philosophy? I don't want to be pedantic and just tell you things.
Yeah.
Okay. So are you familiar with like the reasonable disagreement literature in?
Yep. A little bit.
Cool. All right. So there's a concept of like an epistemic peer, right? Someone who has all the same evidence as you. And there's this interesting kind of thing where you might think, if I know you to be an epistemic peer, right, and you and I disagree, there's a position in the reasonable disagreement literature said that should give us both reason to back or reduce our confidence in our beliefs, right? If I think you're just as smart as I am, have all the same evidence that I do, then it would be irrational for us to cling to our beliefs. Now, that's not the case if you have reason to think someone is what I'll call an epistemic superior. So let's imagine I have reason to believe that you are an epistemic superior. You're smarter than I am. You have more evidence than I do. And I'm also going to say, let's add to it, you're also a moral superior, right? So I think you're a better person than I am, more likely to do the right thing in those circumstances and things like that. I think the problem of evil is in many ways related to epistemic disagreement. Essentially, what you're doing is you're looking at the evil and saying, and all the evidence that you have, and saying there's just no good reason for this, right? And when you reason that there must not be a God, you are ruling out the existence of a epistemic and moral superior, right? But I don't think you can do that, right? Like I could reason that. I don't think you could reason that there's not an epistemic or moral superior there. And again, I think you can build a case for a kind of asymmetry. If there's not this, just because I'm reasoning that there's not an epistemic or moral superior right here, right now, in the moment seeing this, I'm not sure that it completely undermines me in general reasoning about what that person might think about something. So
Could you do it?
Superior. If let's say I have reason to think someone's a math superior, right? And I'm not seeing I'm getting the wrong answer, right? and I'm not seeing it. I was like, well, I can't rule out that this guy's not a math superior or something like that. But that doesn't mean like when I look at a thing like 1 + 1 = 2, judging that he will think 1 + 1 = 2, right? Like I can make predictions about how he's going to judge other things. So I think that's one kind of asymmetry. So that's one possible way a theist might try to navigate the being able to make a judgment in one particular case, or sorry, I got that backwards. Being able to think I can't make a judgment in this one particular case, but in general, I can make reasonable inferences about other future scenarios.
Would it be possible to rule out the fact that they're an epistemic or moral superior if, for example, I can do X, I could move a rock or whatever, and it's very, very easy for me. If they are greater than me in some sense, so they could also move the rock, since it would take very little effort on their part to do the thing, and I can clearly do the thing,
Right.
and that would lead to some obvious good,
Yeah.
like it doesn't crush someone's leg or something. Then the fact that they didn't do it would show some kind of incompetence on their part. But it seems like what you're saying is you couldn't even rule that out because you'd have to just grant there might be some unknown reason, no matter what the
Yeah.
instance is.
Right.
matter
I think
how-
I think I could rule them out as being morally inferior if I thought they were epistemic peers. That is, they have all the same evidence I do, right?
Yeah.
But what I don't think I could do is rule out that they're not like evidential epistemic superiors, right? Like I'm all when I assume that person's evil, I'm assuming they have all the evidence I have, and they're not any smarter than me. They're not seeing something I'm missing, right? I'm right. That another example I used in the paper was, if I see a dog like caught like in a bear trap or something, and I see somebody who's not doing anything, right? My immediate thought is, what a horrible person, right? Like, well, how could you let that happen? And my judgment that they're a horrible person presupposes that they have all the evidence, right? If you had later told me, oh, they had some evidence you didn't have, right? Like the dog was rabid, there were some children just around the bend, and the bear trap was actually keeping the dog from going after the children or something like that. Then I'd be like, oh, okay, well that changes the scenario. Now, if you told me that, my judgment about the person would change. And so, but let's go back to the scenario where I haven't been told that. If you ask me, can you rule out that they don't have evidence that this dog is rabid and that there's children that is protecting from, like, no, I can't rule that out. I'm assuming that that's not the case. I'm assuming they don't have evidence. They don't have any evidence that I don't have. So something similar is going on there, right? I think when we make judgments about people's character, we assume that they roughly have the evidence we have, and there's not something we're missing.
I'm going a little bit further than that. I'm saying that suppose there is someone who's an epistemic superior, they know everything more than you. But if there's some little area where you know everything in that one area, 1 + 1 = 2. Say you know everything about 1 + 1 = 2. And so it's like it's a logical contradiction for it to not equal 2. And so you would presumably say that if there's a math test and the superior being said 1 + 1 = 7 or something, you're like, I think they're wrong. I think they got this one wrong. You can say that they're in error here. You're justified in saying they've made a mistake because even if they're an epistemic superior to you in some way, there are certain cases where you can say, I know enough about this topic to say that they're wrong on this topic.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's right. I think you can do that.
And I think in the context of a God, since a God's omnipotent, all powerful, which presumably means it can do all logically possible things. To some degree, if you can imagine a logically possible way to achieve this goal within your power, within human society's power, to eliminate some evil that you can do, and God's all powerful, so he must be able to do it in some context, and you can do it in such a way that there isn't some kind of consequence to it that's of any kind that would affect the world in any way, and you can do it, but God didn't, and that would seem to be analogous to the 1 + 1 = 7 example, where you can say, I know enough about the situation to know that there isn't a greater good where I could just eliminate this one thing and not have any potential consequences. Like, for example, something we could do here is God could have introduced genetically modified wheat prior to Norman Borlaug or whatever. Since we know that we humans already did that and God didn't do that, and it seems like if there was some unknown consequence for introducing that earlier, it seems quite arbitrary since we already did it as humans, and so since he did not do it, he must have been in error to not do that.
Right. So this actually gets into interesting territory because I agree. I think there are situations where you could judge that a superior got it wrong. And math's a good example. Now, math is, of course, we're dealing with a priori necessary truths, right? It's very easy to be highly certain about 1 + 1 not equaling 7. And so I think the degree of certainty we have is, at least in part, moral matters, and particularly moral matters where you're dealing with someone also just designing a universe, right? That it's at least, we can at least admit, is way less certain than mathematical truths. And so the analogy starts to break down a little bit when the epistemic probability of those things is lower. The other thing is, so this is actually getting kind of close into the best of all possible worlds, or the no minimum amount of evil kinds of problem of evil arguments. And that's actually the other version of skeptical theism that I thought would be interesting to explore. So are you familiar with like sort of Van and Wagen's like no minimum claim? And okay, so you know, the thing about if there's a triple O being and, you know, intervening in that one rock case, because they're omnipotent, omniscient, right? They can do that every single time, right? So if you reason in an isolated case, I can do this thing without impacting the world or, you know, sacrificing some kind of greater good. Well, circumstances are very different if a being has the ability to intervene in every single act of evil, right? Or intervene in the creation of good. And so it would just be like God's a fixer in all these different cases. And then I think a nice natural reply is, well, okay, fine. Maybe God wouldn't intervene in all of them, but surely take the totality of evil. We don't need this much, right? And now it's looking like we're into the versions of the problem of evil that Van Wagen is responding to with the no minimum claim, right? And he says roughly that problem of evil arguments that say, even if we needed, they concede maybe we need some evil. This is the version of the problem of evil I'm talking about now might concede, okay, maybe there needs to be some evil in the world to achieve purposes. He needs to allow for some possibility. But damn, do we need this much of it, right? Like, does it really need to be this bad to achieve God's purposes? And Van and Wagen says something along the lines of, well, take, you know, however much evil you might think is sufficient to achieve some greater good that God has in mind. You'll always be able to imagine a world with a little bit less that could probably achieve, right? And so his idea is there's no minimum amount of suffering that might be sufficient to achieve whatever it is God might be trying to achieve that we'd be unaware of. And so it's kind of like the inverse of the best of all possible worlds argument, right? Just like you might say there's no best of all possible worlds, there's no like least evil world, right? Something along those lines. Now, Jeff Jordan responds to that argument by saying, I mean, effectively, he says, eventually the pain and suffering would be so minimal that we would lack the capacity to even detect differences. So he basically says there's going to be, he's basically claiming there's going to be some limit. There's going to be some minimum amount where it just doesn't make a difference for human beings. And one point I offered a response to that. We don't need to go into the details of that response, but this would be another avenue for a skeptical theist to go. This is a different kind of skeptical theism because it's not attacking there's no greater good. It's basically saying we should be skeptical about what the space of worlds are that would be available to a triple O being to achieve some greater goods that might have evil. So we should be skeptical about whether there's a minimum or not. That's just, I honestly have no idea if there would be some minimum amount, something along those lines.
My intuitive response would be from the way I like to approach the problem of evil is to say that if there was a perfectly moral being, whatever goods there must be, known or unknown, have to be attainable in some way relative to this world. And so if I had an exact copy of this world, I must get all of the goods, whatever they are, all the potential goods, because they must be attainable in this world. Otherwise, the argument wouldn't work anyway. So if I have an exact copy of this world and I have all of the goods and we add one extra good or something, like let's say God didn't force us to be here. It's a choice. We can choose to be in this world, or we can choose to go to our own world of our own design or something. Then now all of the goods that could ever be are an option for me. I now have all of the goods, but I can then have one more good. I can choose to not do those things, which I think would be a good. And so for me, that seems to undercut the whole argument, because I'd say something like, well, I have all of the goods as an option here, but I'm just choosing to not partake in them because I have free will or whatever, using the free will defense. How would you respond to that? Just taking the entire world as a whole, say, here, okay, I have all the goods, known and unknown, and I just add an extra thing as I can just choose to do those or choose not to.
I'm not sure I followed. So I don't think I followed the response.
Well, so the argument goes something like, whatever the unknown goods are, they're in this world. They have to be in some sense. So all of the
we're including like even if they're future goods. Well,
yep,
past,
everything.
present, future. Yeah,
all of the goods have to be in this world.
Yeah.
And so if I have an exact copy of this world and just add one thing, God gives everyone a little option to enter this world or to not enter this world. All of the potential goods are still an option. Every person could choose to have the goods by entering this world. But they could choose not to, just choose to go to their own world or whatever. And so that seems to keep all of the potential goods, whatever they are, known and unknown, and have a logically possible world to have all of the goods. But people just don't choose them. And that seems to be a way to solve the problem of the unknown goods problem.
I got it. Okay. So now it's hard for me to know how to respond, because I need the scenario to be fleshed out to know like the conditions under which we're being given the choice. Like, is it kind of like like a Rawlsian veil of ignorance kind of thing? It's like, but kind of the inverse. You know exactly what you're going into. It's going to be this kind of world. Like maybe before we get put into a body or something. I don't even know if there are souls or not, but let's just, before you get put into the body, you get to choose, right?
Yeah, that'd be one way to do it.
Is that the idea? Okay.
You could also take it a more literal approach and say God just sends you an iPad from heaven and you get to select, like, right now, who you are right now, to keep all of the past goods. You can just choose stay in this world or not stay in this world or whatever. That would work too.
Right. Now it's hard because I mean, there are possible goods that might be of value because they're unknown to you. So I don't know, like, right, it may be that there's some kind of reveal, right, where it's like maybe the goods aren't even in this world. Maybe the goods are like when the whole story's over or something like that. But the only way to appreciate those goods were to have gone through this in a particular way. So if those are the nature of the goods, I'm actually trying to I have a hard time figuring out like how this is a logically possible scenario, right? Like, what if the goods require our ignorance of what they are? Then we'd be given a choice. But what would the choice be? Go into this
world and forget. So you could
into this world and forget. And then, of course, it's like, for all we know, that's the way God set things up. Maybe we did come in from that omniscient state and we're all like, yep, let's do this thing.
Yeah, it would just contradict the Bible. And so most Christians would have to disagree with most of what the Bible says at that point. So I wouldn't say this would be an argument against any possible version of a moral being, but it would definitely be an argument against Christianity in that context.
Well, that's the other thing. I think Christians need to be way more open to that. They get some of the metaphysics of this world wrong. And I'm not like an errantist about the Bible. I think we ought to be open to, like, maybe some of those details aren't right. I mean, Christianity literally cropped up out of Judaism saying, you know what, maybe some of those details aren't right. Maybe it's not like an earthly king. Maybe it's this other kind of king, right? So like Christianity has a history of like re-envisioning the metaphysics of the world they inhabit. And, so be
But
it.
every jot and tittle, that's not right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's going to fly in the face of what some things in the Bible say, but
Do you think
I'm
so?
much more inclined to be like, so be it.
Do you think it could ever be rational to, like, from my perspective, I think it would be irrational to believe that. So say like there's Hitler or somebody, and you see Hitler as a moral and epistemic superior to you, but he's just killing all of these Jews, and you get this cognitive dissonance. Like that doesn't seem right. This seems bad. At what point are you justified in saying, nope, I think he's just bad?
Yeah.
But given your argument, is there a point where you could say that? Is there some amount of suffering where you could rationally conclude, I think this is not a good thing to believe anymore?
Yeah. I think you could get to the point. I do think you could get to the point where I don't think you'd have to just blindly follow the creature. I think it's actually fair to just be like, until I get an explanation for what's going on. I think it's fair. I think it's okay to live a life of faith and still think God has a lot of explaining to do. Right? Like this is I'm so in my sense, I'm hopeful that this is going to make sense. Right? And if I never get an answer to that, I do think I'd be upset. Like at some point, I'm hopeful that there is something like that. And this, or if there is a being, then that was C.S. Lewis's worry. He became a theist before he became a Christian. He was on board with the idea that there was some kind of designer of all this, and that was sentient and had an enormous amount of power. But he was really worried: is the thing evil or not? Right? Like, are we really just like in a universe created by an incredibly powerful evil being? Before he later became a Christian.
That would be one of my fundamental questions is, let's suppose this is an epistemic option, or you can take this position that there is a epistemically greater, morally greater being. But if that's an option, and especially with the omni properties, you just assume it has these omni properties. What would it take to doubt that? What would it take to say this is an irrational position? What kind of epistemic evidence would you need? Is it even possible to have any evidence where you could doubt this position, or is that at that point is just so beyond you that you can't ever doubt it once you've accepted that proposition?
It's a good question. So part of the thing, let's go back to the Hitler analogy. Part of the reason the Hitler analogy is so compelling is we're imagining something. I think it's hard to get away from our biases and treating that person like this person couldn't have all that much more evidence than me, right? Like, right? But when you're talking about a being that's triple O and has an infinite array of options, right? Like, looking at his J.C. Penney catalog of worlds that he could order up, right? Like he's flipping the page. Now this is a catalog that has an infinite number of pages in it, right? For any amount of good in the world, you could always imagine a world with a little bit more good, right? Like one more planet of shiny, happy people singing, right? Just like you could always imagine better and better worlds. And so this is the idea behind. So the argument against the best of all possible worlds argument is that there is no better. And then Van Wagen's claim is, and guess what? There's no floor either, right? There's no minimum amount of suffering. So it's infinite in both directions. And I look at this one world, I don't know like what it would take for me to think, surely this page in the catalog isn't the one that would have been selected. I don't know.
So, because my concern there is that if this principle has no epistemic means of correction, usually I don't think those are very good principles. It seems rather circular. Once you've accepted them, you're kind of done. There's nothing you can do at any point anymore. And so that would be a concern that you could essentially do this with a bunch of different ideologies and just say there's this some kind of something greater that we could always just say, oh, well, we don't know. God works in mysterious ways. And that would allow for essentially an infinite amount of potential beliefs that you could accept with equal epistemic assurity. And there's no way to distinguish between them at any point because they're all just beyond us. So doesn't that mean all of them are irrational to believe for any reason? If we have some kind of belief that there is this thing, and there's no way to overturn it, well, how did we justify that belief in the first place?
Right. So let me just flesh that out with details. The claim was if you've got a belief and there's no way to epistemically correct for it. It's analogous to like conspiracy. I'm using it's analogous to conspiracy theories, right? Like someone believes something, and any evidence you give against them, they just flesh out the story just so, so that the story now fits, right? And so they're rather than be responsive to the evidence, they just fill in the details of like how this thing could be. Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable worry with conspiracy theories. I think it's a, but again, I don't know how to put my finger on it, but in ordinary everyday contexts where there's, most of these things can be decided empirically, and we're assuming all the actors and operators are like us. Yeah, I feel like that's reasonable. I just honestly don't know what to think when we're thinking about these grander cosmic kinds of things. I don't have firm views on that. I might be kind of a boring philosopher brought on because I don't have strong, firm views about much of anything. And in fact, I think the world would be a much better place if people were a little bit more intellectually humble and just, I don't think we should have a whole lot of confidence in our philosophical beliefs.
Yeah, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing, right? The Socrates quote.
Yeah.
But I want to ask in a different way, slightly different way. Let's say that, so I have some belief that is so strong that it can't be epistemically overturned. In order to justify that belief, it seems like you would need an amount of evidence that would be proportional to it in some way. So, like, what evidence could get you to the point to have that belief and have it be a justified belief in the first place? It seems like the amount of evidence required to get you there would be essentially the same amount of evidence that would be required to overturn the belief. And since nothing can overturn the belief, it seems like you have to have made some leap beyond the evidence to come to this conclusion that you have this justification of whatever this belief is that can't be overturned.
Yeah.
If there's not enough evidence to overturn it in the world, then there seems like there wouldn't be enough evidence to get to the point where it's justified either.
Right. That's good. I like that. So if I follow correctly, claim is if it's going to be rational to hold a belief, I'm trying to get the principle before my mind. If it's going to be rational to hold a belief that is in some sense can't be disproven, there's nothing that would walk you off it. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying there's nothing that would walk me off of it, right? I'm just saying that this particular version of the problem of evil won't walk me off it, right? Like, I think there are other things that could happen that would make me less confident that there's some kind of power out there, right? I can think of that. I can think of those sorts of things. And roughly, it's some of these. So, are you familiar with Richard Swinburne's like the cumulative case?
Yeah.
Theism? Okay. So
it pains me. It pains me to hear those words because I hear them so often.
Well, sorry, I'm gonna say it a couple of times, so trigger warning. So the cumulative case is there's all these different pieces, and it's almost like a kind of inference to the best explanation that there's something out there along those lines. Now, there are some scientific claims that are put in there, right, with respect to certain kinds of design type arguments. You could walk me off my confidence by if the science were updated in some way, shape, or form, right? Like if I had good reason to accept that. Like, so there are ways. But back to the original question, if a belief is in some sense unrevisable by your lights, do you need more evidence? for it to be justified. I don't know that I accept that. Let me give you an epistemological view that I'm sympathetic to. In fact, my own dissertation advisor accused me of making knowledge and justification too easy. And so
It's a bad sign.
well, I passed, so at least I got yeah, he said I'm just gonna, he said, I don't know, I would disagree with you so much. I'm just gonna push and push and push, and you're gonna have to tell me when to stop. So on my defense day, I told that story and said, okay, now it's time to stop. But I think that if something seems true, this is phenomenal conservatism. I think if it seems true and you don't have any weightier seemings to the contrary that are function as a sort of kind of defeater, then I think you're justified in believing that thing. And so that, I mean, if I think that commits me to denying what you said, that you need weightier evidence if you have something that is in some sense going to be difficult to revise or something like that. I'd have to think through that more.
Well, my objection there would be is that I would technically agree that if you have this, if it seems true and you have no defeaters, it's rational belief. But in this context, this belief, there could be no rational defeaters, and there's a problem. So
Yeah.
no, it's just it seems true. That
Right.
part is questionable to me, because these things, like if we start seeing Hitler like gas babies, that should be something that should count as a rational defeater,
Yeah.
or something that
Yeah.
should at least make you think it's a rational defeater.
Yeah.
And if your principle is such that it's just eliminated all of those, there can't even be a rational defeater, that seems to be a problem.
Yeah. Another thing I like this a lot. This is good. I need to think about your principle more. So I don't have any
Gotcha.
quick, slick reply on that. And I also need to think about what are the commitments of the skeptical theist? Is there really no possible reason that should walk them off that belief?
Yeah, because that to me sounds a lot like the conspiracy theory thing, where no matter what you see, you're going to make it fit your worldview. And so without having some criteria to establish whether or not it would or would not actually count for or against, and having some falsifiability criterion of some kind, it doesn't seem like it's a good rational position to hold in that context, just for the same reason as the conspiracy theory thing. And I think there's a potential defeater for those kinds of arguments, in that we know we have this bias of confirmation bias, where we're going to try to make evidence fit, and having a principle that's just a perfect instantiation of confirmation bias, where no matter what you see, it's gonna fit, seems dubious to me.
Yeah, I have to think more about that. I don't know how much time we have. There are other interesting things in the philosopher's toolkit, so to speak.
Go for it. I don't have a time limit.
What's that?
I normally set it for an hour, but I don't have a time limit, so we can keep going past that. But yeah, go ahead, bring up whatever you want.
So there are reasons. So back it up. There are other kinds of states and other kinds of ways we could think about the properties of a theistic God, that I think have some relevance here. So a buddy of mine in grad school pointed out to me at one point that there's a case to be made that Christians shouldn't think that God is omnipotent. That a lot of these, a lot of the language talks about things like being almighty, as in like more powerful than anything else.
Do you want to mention your camera did just go out of focus? I don't know if you care or not.
Here, let me see.
There you go. Got it. Got it.
So there are reasons he had for thinking that it's a live option that the Christian story could basically be true, but the God is not as powerful. It's not omnipotent powerful. And the reason I think the reason at least a lot of contemporary philosophy religion classes focus on the triple O being is because if you could make and this is what he would always say, if you could make the case for the existence of that thing, right? If you could make it reasonable to believe in that thing, and you could show that there's no good arguments to think that that thing does not exist, all other possible options for the theist come along for the ride, so to speak. So it's like let's shoot for that one in our philosophical reasoning, and let's target that one in our philosophical reasoning, and then everything else comes along for the ride. So what I was saying is, like, Christians ought to be open to revisions of what the underlying metaphysics of the world is like. I think and this just doesn't happen that much in philosophy of religion, and I wish it did. I wish we would explore other possible distributions of divine properties that are compatible enough with Christian theism. So that's sort of one option.
Oh,
Another,
you mentioned that you should doubt that he's omnipotent. Now, I don't really know what it means to be omnipotent. I don't. It's like do anything logically possible, not in contradiction with his nature. Like, to me, it seems like a really wishy-washy term that can mean essentially whatever you want it to mean.
yeah, I don't know what it means either.
So to me, I just always took it as like, okay, it's really powerful. I'll just
Super powerful.
fine, really powerful,
Super
whatever.
powerful. Yeah.
Go for it. And so when you say that they should doubt it's omnipotent, what specific definition of omnipotent do you think they should be doubting?
Well, I mean, it can do all logically possible things, whatever that is, right? Yeah, it might not need to be that powerful. I mean, it could. For all I know, something.
What would be like an example of something it might not be able to do that you think would be a rational way to consider God, to say, well, it can't do this? Well,
it may not have as much control over being in all the places at all the same time, right? I mean, it might be like it's a live option that something very close to the Christian story could be true, but it's like a super powerful Gandalf or something like that that's at the helm, right?
Mormonism, just straight up Mormonism. All right.
It could be something like that. I don't know.
Sure.
Is that really Mormonism? Is it God?
Yeah. So Mormonism God is just a super evolved being. It's not the original thing that was created. It's just a really powerful being and created all.
Yeah, fair enough. So that, I mean, there's a live option. So there's a whole space for something like the Christian story to be true, with a wide range of possible things at the helm, so to speak. And again, for all I know, maybe some of those are the options, right? Maybe we're wrong about this thing over here, right? And ought to be open to that. There's another array of options open. So I wrote another paper I wrote was on divine hiddenness. And I'm sure you're familiar with Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness stuff. So
God wants a perfect loving relationship with all of us. Why is he so hard to find?
Yeah, why is he not?
Why are there, what is it?
All the time.
Something non-believers, non-resistant non-believers or something.
Yeah. It should be they should be culpable for their non-belief. It should be their fault, right? But it's not their fault. They don't have enough evidence, right? They're perfectly rational in their non-belief. But one of the things he said is necessary for a personal relationship with God is belief, and belief in the sort of Western sense of the word, right? Which is like an internal, yes, this thing is true, with high degrees of confidence that it's true. I gave a bunch of examples where I thought it was possible to have a personal, loving relationship with someone and not believe that they exist. And so I don't think so. There's like I gave an example of like someone's chatting with someone online, comes to believe that there's not even a person there, that it's just a really sophisticated AI program, something or other. But they think to themselves, this person, if they were real, it'd be so amazing that I'm just going to go along with this. And then later they actually do meet up in real life and they get married and they live happily ever after. And someone says, well, when did your relationship start? And they said, well, it started, fun fact, it started back when I didn't even think this person existed. Something like that. I didn't believe in their existence. And there's this passage in the Bible that I've always kind of puzzled over, where Paul says something like, Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. Right. And my read of that is, the first instance of belief is it's a lower stakes mental state than what we mean by belief in English. And it could be something like hope. It could be something like acceptance, or sort of like philosophers make that distinction between belief and acceptance, right? And it's a live option that Christians could, live out their lives and actually think to themselves, it is irrational to believe that there is this thing, right? In that strong sense of the word. But there's this other thing that's I can do. And so I think those are live options for Christian theists as well. There's going to be a lot of Christians who don't agree with me, particularly most of what I would call like Americanized Christianity, like really stigmatizes doubt, thinks there's something sinful about it, that it's not okay. And I think that's a huge misread on their part.
Yeah, I think that's a human thing. Lots of humans have that Andrew bias where it's just inherently, it must be this way, we must be right, and if you're wrong, you're just evil or something. You worship the devil. But what would you be like? What would be the definition of belief under that context? What would be the scope? Would it be simply like me acting as if it's true, or?
Yeah, that's the definition of acceptance. So when there's a lot of philosophers who do work on this, even outside of philosophy of religion, and roughly the idea is, examples they use are like when you remain loyal to a friend despite the fact that there's some evidence that they did the murder, right? It's like, look, there's a lot of evidence pointing your way. I can't bring myself to believe you're innocent, right? But I'm willing to like hold off on calling the cops for a few hours, and I will accept that you are innocent. And roughly what that means, I will treat you as though I don't think you did it. I won't do the things that I would normally do, believing that you are guilty, those kinds of things. That's like an example of acceptance, is sort of acting. There are in some of those examples I gave, you might say that they're acting as if it's true. I'm not sure if hope would be the same thing, but like when someone hopes something is true, and because they hope it's true, they go through the motions, like the mother who hopes her son will return from the war, even though there's a lot of evidence that he won't. So she's not cleaning out the room, right? She's not giving his things away, those kinds of things. So something along those lines.
Well, there's further things is like I'm an atheist. I don't believe it's true, but I'm still going to do all the Christian stuff. I'm like, all right, I'll give it a shot. I'll do the Bible, I'll eat the cracker, and I'll pray, and I'll do the stuff. Would that still count as belief? Or what about the presuppositional one, where everybody knows in their heart God is real, even if you're completely unaware of the fact that you know? Would that count as belief?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, it's so hard to say, like with a 3-sentence description of a scenario, like what's the mental state described in that scenario. But yeah, I mean, this is sort of what I'm thinking. I think it would be possible for someone who like does not believe God exists to do something to have that relationship with God. And I don't know that it's eating the cracker or reading the Bible. I don't know that it's that, right? I think there's a certain there's a kind of like a way you live out your life and your interactions with other people that strikes me as the sort of more fundamentally important thing. But just being a loving person, being a forgiving person, those kinds of things. Yeah, I actually think there are a lot of atheists out there that are better Christians than a lot of Christians. So
Yeah, that would make sense. Why Jesus like praises the centurion, saying he's a better Jew than all the other Jews at the time. So that would be consistent with some of the things Jesus said for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Why do you think it is that Christians don't doubt those claims? And do you see it in other religions where they take their religious beliefs less literally? Because it seems like a common thing, especially in Abrahamic religions.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. To be honest, I'm not a super expert on lots of other faiths to the degree that I would know if that's a part of it. But um, it sure seems like there are some um, Eastern traditions that sort of like um, there's a lot more room for skepticism and intellectual humility in those traditions. And so uh, I can't pinpoint any particular one off the top of my head. Um, and I don't know why this is in part a psychological claim or a historical claim, and that's I'm sort of getting outside my lane when I do this kind of speculation. So I'm just going to do some armchair psychology for a second. So uh, I I think um, I think when religion started to become an important part of the state and an important part of like preserving social order and things of that nature, um, you, it it wasn't going to play that role if you didn't punish people who were skeptical, right? Like you needed it to be true, and you needed everyone to accept it to be true, because that's how you were going to get people in line, right? Something along those lines. And so I think when religion becomes an ineliminable part of state to sort of keep to preserve social order, the uncertainty of it doesn't work, right? If you're just talking about how am I going to live my personal life, right? Not seems like much more room for uncertainty, much more space to like figure this shit out. Sorry, but then
You can curse on here. There's no problem.
okay, you're just figuring it out. There's less room for that. It doesn't play that social role. So my armchair sociology is when religion is an important part of preserving social order, um, that religion is inevitably going to involve to require certainty, right? Um, because the way it preserves social order is people accept certain claims of the religion, and then that dictates their behavior to like play along and be nice, right? As soon as everybody starts doubting this stuff, they're not believing the things that are going to have them engage in the behaviors that the state needs them to engage in. And so I think that's probably right part of the explanation for why the religions that are so dominant also have this kind of little patience for uncertainty. I think that's me doing some armchair sociology for you.
Yeah, it definitely sounds reasonable to me. It aligns with my like Robert Sapolsky did a um, seminar on the origin of religion, said it could possibly be from like people with schizophrenia who had these really passionate ideas, and it was adopted as this way of social control, and that was one of his foundational beliefs about why religion is so popular and evolutionarily successful across the world. So that would definitely make sense.
Yeah.
Any other interesting arguments you've been researching recently?
No, I haven't done much philosophy of religion in a long time. Like I said, when I crossed over into the dark side of administration, I've been mostly focused on sort of more broader questions about moral reasoning, moral epistemology. Been getting really into the science on cognitive bias and um, moral psychology stuff.
Moral realist?
I am a moral realist, yes.
Are you theist or atheist?
If someone, like G. Moore said, before you answer a philosophical question, you got to get clear what the question even is. I would consider myself a theist, but I think there are a lot of Christians who would say I'm not. So, but yeah,
Well, for the
I think I am.
purposes of moral realism, do you think morality is grounded in God in some sense?
No, I don't. Yeah.
Please explain more, because that's phenomenally interesting.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, the Euthyphro problem, I think, just destroys divine command theory. Like there's just no, right. If it's God's approval that makes things morally right, then it's completely arbitrary what is morally right or wrong. In fact, that's a very simple solution to the problem of evil. None of this is evil. God approves of it.
Yeah.
Right. That's, and that's the other fun fact. Problem of evil doesn't get off. I don't think problem of evil gets off the ground unless you're a moral realist. I don't think you can do it. So I think you've got to be a moral realist if you think the problem of evil is a problem. And I think you've got to be a moral realist that doesn't ground moral facts in God's approval. Because
to be fair, I think you can do like an internal critique and say, if you're a moral realist and you believe in God, and you can be a moral subjectivist and be like, I don't think it's evil, but if there wasn't,
that's fair. No, you're right. Sorry. If you were accepting the problem of evil as sound, I'll say that. If you're just saying you over there have a problem, if the way you're approaching the problem of evil is you over there who are a theist and a moral realist, you have this internal inconsistency problem. I don't have it because I don't believe in God and I'm not a moral realist. So it's not a problem for me, but it's a problem internally for you, for your worldview. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
So I have two questions. One would be what do you think morality is grounded in, and what is your response to it's just God's nature response to the Euthyphro is a false dilemma. It's just God's nature. It's not his will.
Yeah, I guess I don't even really know what is being claimed about God at that point when you say it's his nature, not his will. I don't know what to say. I don't think I even quite understand the response. Sorry, what was your other question?
What do you ground morality in? What do you think is, if it's not God in some sense, what grounds morality, moral realism?
Yeah, I don't know yet. I've been trying to figure that out. I'm not sure what it's grounded in. I just, to some extent, I just think it's a fundamental feature of there are just these things that are wrong, and I'm not sure that there even necessarily is a ground. So a lot of conceptual analysis is trying to sort of figure out what the bedrock properties of the world are that things are built up out of, and I think when you have sentient creatures that are capable of pain and have interests and things like that, it comes along for the ride that there are certain things that are wrong to do. And I don't know that I can take it. It's not turtles all the way down. At some point, I think it just sort of stops, and there are these things, and they are wrong. And I don't know that they necessarily have to have a ground, if that makes sense.
Well, I'd say that is a ground. I'd say there is something there. The way I like to phrase it is, I think I'm also a moral realist, even though I'm an atheist, and I think that there are certain properties in the world that we haven't discovered or expressed with science yet, and like higher order emergent properties, some unknown law of physics is what I would call it. I think that there is some moral foundation in the universe as an unknown law of physics, and it is in this higher order things that we just don't know about yet. And I think we're going to discover that in the future. That's my argument.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of with you, although I don't know that we're going to discover it. So this is another thing about that I'm fascinated by, and why I think people should be more open to there being not magic, because I think magic is just science that we don't understand yet. But to define magic that way is like science that we don't understand, something along those lines. So it just seems like it seems like it's not explained by our laws of physics. But as soon as we figure out what's going on there, I think it stops being magic, which our physics has just been updated. But anyway,
I would say that there could be like a different ontology other than just matter and energy, and that ontology has some kind of extra essence to it that operates in some way analogous to how we describe magic. You'd say, yeah, there's the
Yeah,
magic ontology. It's over there.
yeah. So, but anyway, the reason I think we should be more open to the existence of things like gods or deities or other kinds of creatures that are outside our ability to perceive is um, a lot of the explanation for all of our cognitive biases are roughly that our brain makes all kinds of shortcuts because it was survivally advantageous for our brain to make shortcuts, right? Rather than sit there and deliberate about whether or not there's a tiger there, just assume there's a tiger there and get the hell out, right? Like, and so, I mean, this is part of the reason why it almost feels like we're programmed to see faces in things. Like, you know how you look at wood grain floors? I mean, there are alien faces all across my living room floor, right? And I see them staring at me every time, right? So our cognition, now, it's survivally advantageous to get at the truth, but really it's survivally advantageous to get at the truth that's an immediate threat to you and your offspring, right? Like those are the things that it's important to have accurate beliefs about. So our cognitive equipment did not evolve to, it would be a miracle if our cognitive equipment evolved to the point that we would detect angels, demons, like whatever, right? Like unless there was some survival advantage to being able to detect those things, it'd be a miracle to do that. So I think we have good reason to believe that our cognitive equipment is like not the best, right? In terms of, you know, getting at the fundamental truths of reality and the underlying metaphysics of the world. And so I don't know how we got down this path, but it strikes me as it would be remarkable if our brains were good enough to do that. So, I remember you said we'll eventually figure out what grounds morality. I'm not sure we will. I think it's real, but I'm less optimistic that we have the capacity to detect a ton of stuff that's going on in this universe and could be going on around us right now.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's the common argument of quantum physics is that the way our brains intuitively evolved has absolutely no way to really understand what's going on in quantum physics. It seems like randomness is a thing. All right, it's a fundamental force of physics now. Okay, then I'll just accept that. Cool. But I think that whether we discover it or not, the potential for it being like an unknown law of physics, I think is there. Because I think that physics is broader than what we've discovered. I think we've only touched the surface.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. 100%.
Well, we've been going for about an hour and a half. Really appreciated you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Let's see. I'm trying to think. Not really. I mean, there's if anybody here is in the Midwest, around Cincinnati, cincyethics.org, we do a lot of K through 12 ethics education and leadership development work. So if anybody's interested in that kind of work, happy. If any of you are educators, we also do ethics education and leadership work for corporations and organizations. I do some work with the FBI at their National Academy, doing some moral reasoning workshops and things like that. So if anybody's interested in that, you can hit me up, cincyethics.org. If you email info@cincyethics.org, that goes to our program manager and myself. So happy to talk more about that if anybody's interested.
Go Buckeyes. That's what somebody in the chat said. All right. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.
See ya.